I'm going to talk about publishing ethics policies and approaches that we've been working on at Elsevier in conjunction with our publishing editors, journal editors, even some of the lawyers like me get involved in some of these issues. And we're trying to work hard to clarify and make clear what those policies are. So that's the kind of approach that we've been taking. We often talk about this as a kind of community approach, because it does involve quite a collaboration across the board. Okay. I'm going to try to cover a couple of key issues here, basically talk a bit about the landscape, talk a bit about our determination to set Elsevier policies on a global basis. By the way, I don't mean global domination, I mean across the 2,000 journals that Elsevier publish. Let me just make that clear. I want to talk about our policies and practices with respect to engagement, particularly between Elsevier, our publishing teams, and the external editors-in-chief. And I want to talk about hot issues at the moment.
There are none. You're right about that.
So I think we're going to kind of skip through a couple of slides here and see if we can catch up a little bit. I actually don't know that I really have to convince you that there's more activity going on in the area of publishing ethics. That's one of the reasons why you're all here. And that there's more collective efforts going on. In fact, Jerry's going to talk a bit about that with respect to the co-perspective. I think what I did want to talk about is the notion that within Elsevier, what we basically decided is that there's enough stuff going on. I think it's kind of a recognition that grew in the early 2000s that we needed collectively to do more within the publishing house to deal with this. This, by the way, there's a great recent article that was published in Nature on the rise of retractions, which is a pretty terrific article, and it has some very interesting statistics here, which you can see here on. So that's fabrication or falsification, 11%, self-plagiarism, 17, plagiarism, 16. Interesting, honest error, 28%, which I thought was an interesting stat. And you can also see the kind of rise in the increase in retractions in the recent couple of years. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So what we started to think about is within Elsevier we have quite a complex. We have 2,000 journals. We have some very well-known journals like The Lancet, which historically has had very rigorous disclosure practices, very rigorous publishing ethics policies in general, notwithstanding the fact that they got into a couple of well-publicized issues not too long ago. But what we realized is that there weren't standards that kind of applied across the board. So we didn't really have a single ethical standard that applied to all the journals as a kind of minimum threshold. And those are the kinds of things that we decided we had to work on. We had to actually establish what the rules are before we get into a discussion about the fact that people need to be educated about the rules, and then disciplinary process needs to follow if the rules are violated. So you have to set up what the rules are. So what we started to do in the mid-2000s was to establish a series of documents. We first focused on conflicts of interest. Next, our ethical guidelines, which is basically a broad code of conduct, which I'll describe in more detail later on. That applies to authors, reviewers, editors, and publishers, of course. We also then incorporated a number of these links and references in our electronic submission system. And we've also worked within the industry, particularly with the STM Trade Association, on industry guidelines. And there's a protocol that we helped put into place, which is referred to as kind of the record of science document. That largely has to do with double publication issues and kind of what is the article of record if it's been published more than twice. Then within Elsevier, we also had a lot of discussions about how we should support this process. We did launch a help desk, and in order to do the help desk, which involves staff in both Ireland and the US. So the idea is that we had a helpline that external editors could call or could email with questions about how to handle particular issues.
In order to do that, we had to actually draft a manual of procedures. And when we did that, by the way, liberally copying from things like the code guidelines, we realized that what we had actually was a pretty good document and a series of sort of checklists about how to handle different things. That was very useful because we helped train the help desk staff. But what we realized is that actually those documents and the checklists and the procedures were actually more helpful and more useful than the staff. So we closed down the help desk experiment, but we launched what we call the PERC site, Publishing Ethics Resource Kit, which has all those documents online. And by the way, we sometimes have to teach our own staff about the existence of the PERC site in addition to external journal editors, so it's a constant process. And we have full membership in COPE now since 2009. I should explain that some of our journals, such as The Lancet, were members of COPE for a long time, but now it applies to all 2,000 journals. There's a little bit of art. I don't think you can really see it out there. I was going backwards, sorry about that. But that's kind of what the site looks like. It's possible to read. What we've been doing for the past couple of years is really focusing on the cross-check initiative, which you may have heard about. It's basically being done through the Crossref organization. Great thing about that is that that means that there's 124 publishers involved in Crossref and now involved in Crosscheck. So it's a huge database against which articles can be checked to see if there are duplicates going on. Authenticate software, this is also, there was a previous iteration of that called Turnitin, I think, that was first used for scholarly papers by students. And that was kind of the first iteration. So they're the folks that are actually doing the software behind Crosscheck. We piloted the program in 2009, and now it's available for all Elsevier journal editors. The question that we have now is, how can we ramp that up for all submissions? In a sense, we'd like to do that. We'd like sort of automatically all submissions to go through that process against Crosscheck. On the other hand, there are some questions about what that would mean in terms of the resource and what it would mean for Crossref. If you can imagine, since we reject a lot of articles, in a sense, there'd be a lot of extra work that was not directly related to a publication. But we are thinking about it. You might have been on the Crosscheck system, so you know that basically you sort of, just not very good at this. So you sort of do the text in brown, and then you do get the results on this side. I would say, however, that this is a tool. It has to be used intelligently. I think we all know that, for example, there are parts of papers that are going to look very similar to parts of other papers. For example, methods section in a particular discipline. So you really do have to use the tool and apply some intelligence as to whether, in fact, there really is plagiarism that's going on. But it's a good tool. In terms of our basic code of ethics, as I said, we've got the code of ethics that talks about the responsibilities and the obligations of editors, reviewers, authors, and Elsevier itself. And I think these are kind of the standard sense of fair play and integrity that MJ mentioned. It's for editors, it's fair play, it's vigilance and engagement. For reviewers, of course, it's disclosure in case there is a competing interest that happens. Also, of course, confidentiality and hopefully promptness, which sometimes is an issue. Authors, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail on this, it's originality, the question of multiple publication, disclosure and research standards, which covers a variety of issues. And I think what we have said publicly is that our obligation is to help determine, communicate these policies and approaches, support editors in their hopefully rational decision-making processes about these issues, and to also help formulate industry approaches. So in terms of the authorship issues, we do talk a lot about originality. We talk about the fact that plagiarism takes many forms. Clearly passing off another's research as your own is plagiarism. Clearly, copying and paraphrasing without attribution is plagiarism. But it can take a number of forms. The simplest form, the copying of sort of full text of another person's article, is really the easiest to check, and to some extent that's kind of what cross-check is all about. But it can take other forms which are more difficult to really easily make determinations about. Multiple redundant publication. So our view generally is that it is improper to publish or to seek to publish papers describing essentially the same research in more than one journal. And we also describe self-plagiarism as a republication of a prior article that was published. We talk about authorship as overall a significant contribution to the concept design, execution, and interpretation. It does strike me, however, that that is perhaps becoming a somewhat old-fashioned notion of authorship. Clearly, there's a lot more collaboration happening, across the board, across different universities. I think in the future, we're going to have to think very seriously about how to define authorship. It may well be that some people are involved in the concept and design of one element of a research project, others are involved in other aspects, and we really have to kind of think through what that means in terms of authorship. We also talked about the fact that there will be contributors who will not be authors, and that those contributors need to be acknowledged as well. And there are various discipline-specific ways of doing that, and various levels of contribution that should be acknowledged. In terms of the disclosure, our language is quite broad, so anything that might be construed to influence the results or interpretation, and we do require all sources of financial support. There are a fair amount of variations amongst different publishers and different journals about the level of financial support, but we do have a fairly broad interpretation here. One question that does come up sometimes is whether all co-authors should be obligated to disclose, or whether we can rely on the corresponding or principal author to assess the situation with their co-authors and to indicate whether or not that can be disclosed. Some of our journals go with the all co-authors must sign the disclosure statement. Other journals are a bit different, and I think the problem for us with respect to that kind of approach is particularly in our physics journals, where the number of co-authors is now approaching dozens and hundreds of co-authors. So it does become a logistical issue. I mentioned briefly the research standards. One of the things that we say very simply in terms of the reportage requirements is that the paper should present an accurate account and an objective discussion and acknowledge all sources. So this is kind of the standing on the shoulder of giants issues here. I think we actually talk about the paper being placed in the context of existing research. We do talk about data retention, which is a hot issue these days. Our basic policy says that the author should retain data in case it's required for possible peer review. As we now know, there are lots of discussions about whether or not that data should be in fact disclosed, whether it should be curated, whether it should be made available automatically for peer review. So our policy is a few years old, and it's probably something that we're going to take a look at in the near future. On the other hand, we also know that researchers are sometimes very cautious, and sometimes for very understandable reasons, about disclosing some data. In terms of research subjects, and this is both sort of with respect to animal research and obviously with humans, although animals don't really do informed consent, but humans should with respect to these things. These are often matters of national law, often matters of research agency processes and institutional processes as well. So all those things kind of have to be ticked off. So we do have some stats here. We have a regular retraction and removal panel process which focuses on the online record, which I'll talk about in a second. But we also try to compile a report based on the publishing team's reporting about the number of cases. What we found actually is 2011 seems to be suspiciously fewer than 2010. which actually doesn't make sense because, as you'll see in a second, the number of retractions is actually going up. So we think that we have a bit of communication and education to do within the house. But it is interesting that plagiarism is right up there at number 20. Although this is not a scientific sampling by any means. And authorship disputes seem to be number 2. That's roughly consistent with other stats that we've seen. This is basically talking about the retractions and removal process. So I'm one of the 3 folks within Elsevier that look at every retraction and removal notice that goes through the Science Direct online platform. I think there are 2 main reasons to do this. One is that it is an opportunity to probe the process. So with respect to kind of fair play, with respect to the communications with an author about whom a complaint has been made, we do have the notion that fair play requires some communication with that author. It doesn't require that the editor accepts what the author says. It just requires that the author have a chance to communicate and provide some feedback about the allegations made. I think the other important part of this is, frankly, a question of style. There are certainly many notices that we see that are fulsome, that really describe precisely what the issue is, where the author takes responsibility for the error, and is very clear about what the error was. There are other notices that are remarkable in their lack of clarity about exactly what's happened. I think our perspective is that you do look for a happy medium. You do need enough information to really be able to determine what the issue was with respect to that particular article. On the other hand, you don't need to know all the ins and outs. You don't need to know about the disputes among the lab partners and who left where and went off to another institution and took their research with them. So some of that is really kind of unnecessary. And from a lawyer's perspective, you always like to get the defamatory comments out in any event. So we do have some stats here which also are impossible to read, but these stats do indicate that the volume of retractions, not surprisingly, has gone up fairly significantly over time. We kind of started with retractions and removal policy somewhere around here in the early 2000s, and it picked up to kind of a 60, 70 retractions per year. Granted, that's over a base of about 250,000 articles published per year. So from that perspective, that's not a lot. But this year, it's already over 70 or 80. So we're on par to have a plus 100 retraction year, which will be quite high for 2011. I think that the question of engagement, these kinds of allegations come a variety of ways. We are really going to rely on the judgment of the editors. I think there's often this question about, well, who should be responsible for this stuff? And it won't be a surprise to you to know that with rare exceptions, people don't actually want to be involved in this stuff. The rare exceptions are people that take their stewardship responsibility very seriously. And those folks should be applauded. Many of us, however, feel like it's the last thing on earth that you really want to be involved with. So there's often this question of, well, you should do it, and you should be involved. You should be responsible. Many of these issues are going to require knowledge of the actual field, awareness of who is doing research at which institutions, and who's really the different researchers involved, who's likely to be the more senior researcher, and the like. Those issues are going to be best known, we think, by the academic editors in that particular field. But clearly our job is to support them, including the legal team. So that's our sense. We've got some guidelines here about how to do this activity. Again, we do copy liberally from other useful and positive sources. That's a little bit about the PERC guidelines. this is, again, more discussion about kind of what the right balance is. Sometimes institutions are remarkably responsive and responsible. My experience is that tends to be the minority of cases because institutions often also don't want to be involved in these kinds of disputes. So when I hear some stories, sometimes including last night, about institutions that do take responsibility, and I think it's terrific, and I think that should be really commended. But it's not always the case. So no simple solutions here. Maybe cross-check helps us with respect to cross-check. I'm sorry, cross-check helps us with respect to simple plagiarism, but it can't do all these issues. And it's going to take a kind of collective effort to really sort it out. These are some of the hot issues of the moment. The most difficult issues, I think, are the ones at the top, fraud and authorship, because basically no external party is ever really going to be able to determine what the truth is of these kinds of allegations. Some of the hot topics of the moment within Elsevier, I sometimes raise the question of, in terms of the list of shameful and wrongful acts, where does double submission fall? We all know that many young researchers are desperate to get published, and publishing process sometimes takes a long time. So I could imagine being more forgiving of a young researcher who is trying to publish their first paper and submits to 2 journals at the same time. It's wrong. It causes inefficiencies in the system. It ties up resources that should be better spent on other things. But I'm not sure that it rises to the same level of plagiarism, research errors and that kind of thing. So I think we just have to keep some perspective in mind as we think about what's wrong and what is the right punishment to go with that process. So these are some of the other issues that we're also talking about that maybe we can talk a bit more at lunch or question session. Yeah, one last thing. One thing that I do notice is as we make our process more transparent, more visible, as we publish our codes, it sometimes gets used against us and against the editors in a sense. It's kind of barracks room lawyers that point out a third party making a complaint about something that's reading the code of conduct and saying, you should have done this, you should have done that, and you violated the code of ethics in a sense. So obviously there's no way to make policies non-transparent. I think it's the right thing to do and it's the right approach. But you do have to accept that sometimes you're going to get involved in sometimes silly discussions with people about process. But that I think is kind of inevitable. Have to try to remain objective. So I think that's it.